All right. This is the first chapter of Crimes and Survivors after the prologue. And Crimes and Survivors, if you are tempted to buy a physical copy of it, let me ask you to buy it through brooklinebooksmith.com, which is my local independent bookstore. And of course, since this is the middle of the coronavirus epidemic, they are physically closed and they could use your help. Okay. Autumn 1911, Paris. For 7 days, 7 unrepeatable days, he thought they'd have each other forever. They were his family, Gilbert and Perdita and Toby, his father more or less, his wife, his son. They went to the beach. They walked on the sand. They had picnics. Their story was over, and it had ended happily. And then the letters started arriving from Boston, 2 or 3 of them a day. Gilbert's lawyers writing, Harry writing. And you realized they couldn't be a family after all. So here they are. Toby's throwing a ball, and Gilbert's beagle Elphinstone is skittering after it, chasing it into the corners of the room, through the door, down the hall, and limping back triumphantly with it. Toby laughs and throws it again. He and Elphinstone were at it all this afternoon, Perdita says, brushing a hairy curl off her face. We shouldn't have left you so long. She looks up at him, hesitating, before she dares to ask, have you decided? She ought to know there was only one possible decision. We can't keep Gilbert. He's going back to America. No, she says. Oh, no. Toby looks up at her and bursts into tears. Rysden leans down and gathers up his son. It's all right, dear boy. It's all right. It's not all right. Toby hiccups against his shoulder. Rysden smooths his little boy's dark curls. Shh. There. It's not all right. Perdita goes to the door and cries, Aline, it's time for Toby's bath. It's not, but Toby's nursemaid appears. Toby struggles, not wanting to leave. There, baby, Perdita says, you can have Elphinstone again as soon as you're clean. Effing bath, Toby demands. Nothing bath. She gives him a kiss and hands him over, closes the door and leans against it. Why? Did you think it could be different? He puts the ball back in Toby's box of toys and sits down on the sofa, gathering himself to justify what he and Gilbert have done. Elphinstone sniffs at the door and whines. Let him out, Rysden says. Having Gilbert Knight's beagle there is too much like having Gilbert. No, stay, Elphinstone. The little beagle whines once and then obediently, sadly, thumps himself down by the fireplace. Perdita sits down on the sofa too, at the other end, a strip of uncertainty between them. How can you send him back? He's decided to go back. There's a difference. Harry was mistreating him in Boston. Harry was stealing my letters and ignoring him. Uncle Gilbert left with nothing but his dog and the clothes he was wearing. And you're sending him back? He decided, himself. No, he's going back for your sake. For all our sakes, for Toby's. Not for my sake. We'll find ways to keep in touch. We'll write letters, send photographs. Harry will tear up photographs from us. What shall I do when Uncle Gilbert writes back and doesn't say how Harry is treating him? Rysden already knows how Harry will treat Gilbert. Harry has never recovered from being adopted. Nothing is ever enough for him. How will you feel, she asks. I'll feel we're all being responsible. We are not. This is because of Richard. Yes, Richard Knight, Gilbert Knight's nephew, who should have been Gilbert's safely dead nephew, the boy Harry replaced. He half changes the subject. I went to see Richard's grave, he says, when I was in Boston. Did I tell you that? You went to see your own grave? Gilbert had just had the name and dates engraved on the stone. He'd wanted to see Richard. Richard Knight, 1879, 1887. Richard dead and gone. And what was it like? Did you like yourself being dead? That was why he'd gone there, to find out what it was like to survive Richard. I thanked him for being dead and leaving me alive. He brought flowers, half in sarcasm, but he put one of them in his buttonhole and walked away a free man. Not innocent, not happy, but free of Richard. And I'm thanking Gilbert now, he says. I'm sorry I don't let him go, but when I married you, I could think at least she's not marrying Richard. And when Toby was born, he's not Richard's son. He hesitates and says it. He's not a murderer's son. I don't want him to be. It wasn't murder, she says. Richard Knight, supposedly a victim, kidnapped, killed, the body never found, actually a murderer at 8 years old. It wasn't murder. When you shoot a man and he dies, Lev, even when you're 8, especially when you're 8, Gervais has treated a few child murderers, even the staff who were calloused or spooked by them. Uncle Gilbert says it was self-defense. Can you imagine, my love, just how I feel about you and Gilbert having that conversation? Her cheeks redden. That's no excuse to send him home. That's not why. If we kept him here, which we should, sooner or later I'd have to explain why Richard ran away. I'd have to be a murderer. And I'd have to be Richard. Richard owned the night companies. He'd have to be in charge of them. Harry wants the night companies. Let him have them. I want to stay me. So there will be no murderers in this house and no murderers' children. And so you're sending Uncle Gilbert back for Harry to mistreat. I am sending him back to advocate for himself. He can do it. We're both agreed. Will you? I hate this. We'll have Gilbert for a while, he says. He won't go back to Boston immediately. That isn't enough, and they both know it. They sit in silence, she at one end of the sofa, he at the other. Finally, she reaches out her hand. He takes it. This is as close to consent as she'll give. Only for your sake, and I wish you wouldn't. Thank you. He wants to stay, holding her hand in this fragile truce, but she takes it back and sits with her hands folded together on her lap. She presses her wide lips together and shakes her head. She's never been able to hide what she's thinking. What kind of flowers did you bring? She asks finally, a little too brightly. Why on earth do you ask that? Just thinking of you doing it. Chrysanthemums, flowers for the safely dead. What made you think of doing it? Sentiment. Is it that hard? I was thinking, he remembers, because I know who I am, and it isn't Richard. I was going to lose Gilbert and you. It had been a hook in his soul, wanting to stay with them, but he wasn't Richard, so he put a flower in his buttonhole and walked away. He lost both of them and got them back by miracle, but he won't get Gilbert back twice. And when they lose Gilbert, when Harry does the inevitable and mistreats Gilbert again, What will Perdita feel? Will he lose her too? He hasn't been good at keeping people. Will you promise me, she says. She breaks off a moment, then leans forward. Promise me we won't regret it? We won't say we should have done something when we could? I promise, he says. She wants it. He hopes it. But he doesn't believe it, and he doubts she does.